The world is changing. Natural disasters are not something that we can ignore, and while no place is totally disaster-proof, knowing where the risks are lower can make a huge difference in your relocation journey. So today, we are going to dive into the safest areas of Oregon when it comes to natural disaster risk. We're going to go over the kinds of natural disasters that we have here in Oregon and the top 2 Oregon towns with the lowest risk for natural disasters. My name is Clarity Odd, and I'm an active real estate agent who focuses on working with buyers who are relocating to Oregon. If you're ready to start planning your relocation journey, book a one-on-one consultation with me by using the links down in the description below. Okie dokie, let's jump right in. When it comes to relocating and moving across the country or just to a different state, I am finding that more and more of my clients are asking me about the natural disasters that we have here in Oregon. I found this really great article from the New York Times that they wrote back in 2011, and it came with some really awesome infographics that show the towns across the United States that are at the highest risk for natural disasters. But it also shows those states that are at the lowest risk of natural disasters. And the lowest risk town in all of the United States is Corvallis, Oregon. But behind that, at number 7 is where I live in Salem, Oregon. So first, let's talk about what natural disasters we actually have here in Oregon. Here in Oregon, we have 2 main natural disasters that need to be on your radar if you are thinking about relocating here. The first of those 2 is earthquakes. Now, I know that earthquakes here in Oregon are not going to be as frequent as some other places on the West Coast, but they do happen here in Oregon, and that's because Oregon sits on the Cascadia subduction zone right off of the Oregon coastline. And what this means is that there is a huge potential for a massive earthquake that is going to rock all of Oregon. The next natural disaster that you need to be aware of, which is wildfires. My guess is that you love Oregon partly because it is just so fucking green everywhere, right? We have trees in every single direction that you look. But wildfires have become increasingly common in Oregon because of all of this lush greenery that we have. Wildfires are just a natural part of the ecosystem here in the summertime, at least as long as I've been alive, but they have definitely been increasing in strength and regularity every single summer. They are getting worse and worse. The last thing that we cannot overlook is flooding. Some regions in Oregon, especially those that are near the rivers and the lower elevations, they are at risk of flooding. Now that you've got a little bit of context for some of the main natural disasters that we might have here in Oregon, let me pull up this infographic again. Remember that this infographic is from 2011, and while undoubtedly the climate has changed since then, I feel like this infographic is still a great representation of the risk associated with natural disasters and how the city of Corvallis and Salem are at low risk when we step back and look at the totality of the United States. We sit right alongside the Cascadia subduction zone, which is off of the Oregon coast, and we are just waiting for a massive earthquake. It is not a question of if we will have a massive earthquake. It is a certainty and more of a question of when will we have that massive earthquake. In my 30 plus years of being an Oregonian, there's always been this discussion of like, oh, is the earthquake gonna be here? We don't really know. And it just hasn't come yet, not at least in my lifetime. But that doesn't mean that it won't come in mine or your lifetime. The effects of this massive earthquake that we're waiting for, it is going to be detrimental. And when you go to the Oregon coast, many cities and towns have already implemented tsunami evacuation zones. And this is because the Cascadia subduction zone is right off of the coast of Oregon, which means that fault line sits underwater. And what happens when you have a very big subduction zone, like the Cascadia subduction zone, where it's like this, it pops like that, and it creates a massive wave. That wave is called a tsunami. So when you go around the Oregon coast, you're going to see tsunami evacuation signs everywhere. You're going to see blue lines drawn on the streets and sidewalks, and that is the estimated high water mark. And so presumably if you're above those blue lines, you'll be safe. But that is a serious natural disaster, and I think it kind of feels a little bit lessened because it's like one that we're just kind of like sitting on the sidelines waiting for. But when it happens, when we have a massive earthquake that triggers a tsunami, it will be detrimental. Now, I've worked with enough people from YouTube who are still wanting to relocate to the Oregon coast, and there is plenty of people out there who are comfortable with the idea of living on the coast, even though they know the risks involved. But that's kind of anywhere you move, right? There's going to be some level of natural disaster, and you just have to weigh the pros and cons, and if it works for you. But the tsunami and the earthquake, that's not necessarily too big of a deterrent for many of you folks who are watching online right now. Here where I live in Salem, which remember, ranked number 7 on the lowest risk place to live out of the whole entire United States, we will be protected from the tsunami because we are so far inland from the Oregon coast. We are also in the Willamette Valley, which means that we've got the coastal range to the west, and to the east we have the Cascade Mountain Range. So here in Salem, we don't really need to worry about the tsunami. And same thing with Corvallis, which ranked number 1 on this list. But what we do need to consider is the potential of that big earthquake. I personally do not know how an earthquake would affect the city of Salem or Corvallis, but I have no doubt that the earthquake that we are waiting for is going to be massive, and it will have an impact of some kind on both Corvallis and Salem. So we've wrapped up our conversation about earthquakes, tsunamis. Let's move on to the second type of natural disaster that we have here, which are wildfires. Wildfires have gotten worse throughout my lifetime, and that's because well, the world is heating up and our summers are changing. The summertime here in Oregon typically lasts about 3-ish months out of the entire year, and we can usually expect the temperatures to be around 80 to 90 degrees. But we definitely get summers where that crosses the 100-degree mark. And depending on where you live in Oregon, that number can get a whole heck of a lot higher. For example, in Central Oregon and in the high desert where places like Bend are located, it is dry, it is dusty, and it is hot there. And summer times easily get past the 100-degree mark. In Eastern Oregon, it's the same story. Eastern Oregon is basically a desert, and it can get really fucking hot out there. Central Oregon, Southern Oregon, and Eastern Oregon are going to be the most prone to wildfires in the summertime and having a direct impact on home buyers. Here in the Willamette Valley, we are protected from the majority of those fires because we are in the valley. And remember, the Cascade Mountain Range, it's going to protect us from Central and Eastern Oregon. Here in Salem, the way in which fires affect us is typically going to be from the smoke that blows in. It's very realistic that occasionally in the summertime, we get enough smoke that there are a few days where you have to stay inside and wear a mask because the air quality is just so bad. I expect that every single year it will become more and more intense. Let me reiterate really quick. Here in the Willamette Valley, which is where Corvallis and Salem are located, we are naturally protected from the massive burns and fire season here in Oregon. Places like Central Oregon, Southern Oregon, and Eastern Oregon, they will be more prone to wildfires and the side effects of those wildfires, like smoke. In places like Southern Oregon, there is a town called Medford. And Medford is known for being the smokiest town in the summertime. And that's because there's no breeze in Medford. So it just ends up like the smoke goes in and it just settles and there's no wind to blow it out. So in Medford, there are weeks where you just have smoky fire season. Here in Salem and Corvallis, we don't worry about fire season in terms of like a big fire swooping in and burning your house down. Yes, it is a possibility because nature does what she wants to do, but we don't really worry about the fires in that way. We just focus on more of the smoke. And I personally have never had to evacuate my house in my entire lifetime, but I know for my grandparents who live in Central Oregon outside of Bend, evacuation just becomes like a yearly occurrence for them. It is just the norm. Here in the Willamette Valley, that is not the norm. The last natural disaster on this list, that is flooding. This is kind of a halfway natural disaster to be worrying about because you can avoid flooding very easily just depending on where you buy your house. Here in Salem and in Corvallis, we naturally just get so much rain throughout the year. Here in Salem, we do have neighborhoods that fall within the FEMA flood zone, and that means that you're gonna need extra flood insurance if you are are planning on purchasing a house in any of those flood zones. Thankfully, here in Salem and Corvallis, it is relatively easy to avoid these flood zones, but it is something that you need to be mindful of when you are considering your relocation plans. Here in Salem, we do sit alongside the Willamette River, which naturally just ebbs and flows throughout the year based upon the rainfall and the snowmelt from our mountains. But that means that you're going to see the river is going to be extremely low in the summertime, and then it gets really, really high in the wintertime. But that natural ebb and flow of the river, it is expected and it is normal. Even though this infograph is from 2011, I still believe that it's actually very accurate. At the time that I'm making this video, we have seen the devastations from Hurricane Helene and Milton. We have seen entire towns washed away because of flooding as a result of Hurricane Helene and Milton. And this map is reflecting what we've seen with these natural disasters across the US. It's really interesting to see this 2011 risk assessment and see where we are today. There is no perfect way to avoid natural disasters or the risk that they pose, but being more educated can allow you to make a better decision that is right for you in this relocation journey. And I know that this video, it really leaves you feeling scared, because even as I was typing this up, I didn't want to be alarmist. I didn't want to make you guys scared about relocating to Oregon. But the truth is, we do have issues. We are not a perfect state. We are not immune from natural disasters. We've got things going on, and I think it's important that, although it's really scary to hear, you take all of this into consideration and think about it before you make the move out here. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to want to watch this one next. Bye, friends!